Hello everyone, I'm going to go over your first free response question that you encountered on the mock exam. So I reproduced the question here, and obviously I changed the wording so it could fit here. And so let's just get into it. So it says LNP is a natural monopoly, and I highlighted natural monopoly because that raised a bit of a red flag for me. And I know natural monopoly has distinct aspects about it, and we'll talk about that later when I draw the graph. And it says the firm produces profit maximizing quantity of electricity and earns a positive economic profit. And so I know it makes sense that an electric company is a natural monopoly because we said natural monopolies occur in instances in which the average total cost curve is downward sloping over the range of relevant output, right, over the output that is actually demanded in the market. It might eventually be upward sloping beyond the output that is demanded in the market, but if it's downward sloping over the range of output demanded in the market, then we have a natural monopoly. So that's one of the key features of natural monopolies. And what would cause this ATC curve to be downward sloping? Well, huge fixed costs and relatively trivial marginal costs leads to a downward sloping demand curve, which, if it's a long run ATC curve, has economies of scale over the range of relevant output. Okay, so that makes sense for like utility companies or power companies because they have huge, fixed or initial costs, such as, for like a water utility company would be the pipes, or an electric utility companies it would be whatever is like powering or creating the electricity, and then relatively trivial marginal costs, right? As you add an extra household to the electric grid, or you add an extra household or provide water to an extra household, it's relatively insignificant marginal costs, and so therefore we have, and which I'll show you graphically, marginal cost curve with close to zero slope, right? That is pretty, that doesn't have, or has very trivial marginal costs. Sorry, on my phone I got a notification, so let me check it. So then the first question says, describe a condition that distinguishes a natural monopoly from a typical monopoly. And then I just talked about it, and you can see it graphically. But description, remember, that's an important task word, but it's less important than explanation. Right? So let's just talk about a condition that distinguishes a natural monopoly from a typical monopoly. So we can talk about a relatively flat marginal cost curve, right? Trivial marginal costs, but huge fixed costs or initial costs. But I want to talk specifically about a downward sloping long run average total cost curve over the range of relevant output. And then B, so I'm not going to write that out, but B, draw a graph that shows the profit maximizing quantity, QM, profit maximizing price, PM, and then the area representing economic profit. Okay, and so as you can see graphically, this I kind of reproduced the natural monopoly from your Princeton review, but I could equally make it a more dramatic natural monopoly by just drawing the ETC curve like this, and the marginal cost curve as having virtually no slope, or no slope here, right? But of course, a natural monopoly, it's probably more realistic for marginal costs to eventually rise, and the ATC curve to eventually become upward sloping. And so in the monopoly model, obviously, the demand curve is not perfectly elastic, as in the perfectly competitive model, or the demand curve is not horizontal, because the monopolist owns the whole market. So it's downward sloping demand curve, marginal revenue curve at twice the slope of the demand curve. Talk to me if you want to know why that is. And then the profit maximizing quantity, that condition always holds. It's always going to be the same. It's going to be the intersection of marginal cost and marginal revenue. Look for that intersection. Right, this is the marginal cost curve, this is the marginal revenue curve, and then go down QM. Oh, I should have said too, right, we can see that the marginal cost curve is relatively flat. It eventually rises, but beyond the demand curve and sort of, it seems, beyond the relevant range of output. And the ATC curve eventually rises, but it takes quite a bit of time, right? It's downward sloping. If this is a long run average total cost curve, it has economies of scale all the way until beyond the demand curve, right? Eventually it has upward sloping ATC curve. Okay. And so a natural monopoly, one of the reasons why there's barriers to entry in a natural monopoly, the first firm to enter this market, right, the first firm to lay the pipes down, or in this case an electrical company to create a power generating resource, or to I guess, I don't know what goes into an electric utility company, but to invest in the resource to generate the power, the electricity. They have this natural monopoly because if another firm tried to enter the market, what this firm would do is that they would just price at marginal cost until the other firm left, right? And the other firm would lose, quite a bit of money, right? So the natural monopoly has this ability to protect their natural monopoly. So here is the profit maximizing quantity, QM. We go up to the demand curve and across to find the profit maximizing price. Right, some people want to go across, right, trained you well, but remember that the monopolist still has to respect the demand curve, right? If they had gone across from this intersection, then the quantity demanded would have been huge, right? So go all the way up to the demand curve, and as a monopolist, you have this ability to charge well above marginal cost in some instances, and so use it. Go to the demand curve, and at PM, that's the monopolist price. And that tells you to shade the economic profit, which I'm going to shade in light green. And so remember, go from the price all the way down to the ATC curve. That's the per unit profit. And then across, shade in light green. All of this. This is going to be economic profit, which you can see here. And then the part C of this question asks you about government regulation to produce the max quantity at zero economic profit, label QR and price PR. So the government can institute a price ceiling in monopolists, and we said that price ceilings, unlike in the perfectly competitive model, in the monopoly model, they can potentially expand output and increase social surplus, right? They can be help us arrive at more desirable outcomes. And so I'm going to label this PFR. Well, it says label it PR, but PFR to reflect this idea of fair rate price. So it's going to be the price. So essentially, we're trying to accomplish two things. We're trying to maximize the output, and to ensure that the firm earns zero economic profit or normal economic profit. This doesn't mean the firm earns zero accounting profit, but it does mean that the firm, if it takes into account its implicit costs like the opportunity costs, then it'll earn zero economic profit. And so we're looking for the point that is going to touch the ATC curve, right, because that will be a point of zero economic profit. At the furthest level along the x-axis, and that's going to be right here, where the ATC curve is intersecting the demand curve. And we would go down. This QFR point would be the fair rate price, reflecting this idea of there being zero economic profit. And then we go across to find the PFR point. It tells you to label it. I'm just kind of introducing that term. right? It tells you to label them PR and QR, and that's what you could label them. And so that would be a reasonable price ceiling that the monopolists would just have to take. Like they would earn zero economic profit, but the monopolists would be willing to take that price ceiling. And then finally in D, it asks you about government regulation at the allocatively efficient quantity. So like, what if government set a price ceiling at the allocatively efficient point? Well, first you have to, and would the monopolists be willing to, supply the electricity at that allocatively efficient point? Well, first we have to find the allocatively efficient point. It's going to be the point at which the marginal cost curve intersects the demand curve. And that price at this intersection is going to be the socially optimal or the allocatively efficient point. We said perfectly competitive markets always yield the allocatively efficient price and quantity. And so here at this intersection that we get here, that is going to be the PSO, which is going to represent the socially optimal price, and the QSO, which is going to reflect the socially optimal quantity produced. Now, would this monopolist be willing to supply it? No, because obviously they do not earn economic profit. Or not earning economic profit isn't necessarily a bad thing, but they have quite a bit of loss. Or we can go all the way up to this point to the ATC curve and then shade it red to see the amount that they're losing by supplying at QSO, right, at this price point. And so one way we can incentivize the monopolist to be willing to supply at this point is through what is called a lump sum subsidy. And we said that there's a difference between lump sum subsidies and per unit subsidies, or lump sum taxes and per unit taxes. I'm not going to go into the details here, but lump sum subsidies and taxes affect the ATC curve. A subsidy would shift it down, a tax would shift it up, and then per unit taxes or per unit subsidies affect the marginal cost curve. A tax would shift it up, and a subsidy would shift it down. And so we could institute a subsidy and get a new ATC curve effectively by giving a lump sum to this natural monopolist. We're taking away some of the fixed costs associated with this, with producing this firm, or with entering this market, right? We're taking away the fixed cost by giving them, just straight up cash money, and we shift the ATC curve down, and then a price ceiling at PSO may become more reasonable, right? And so I don't think it asked you to think about ways in which you could actually, force this monopolist to be willing to pay at PSO or this socially optimal, allocatively efficient price, and produce at that quantity. But that's one way you can do it, right? Shift the ATC curve down with a lump sum subsidy. Okay, we're done.